Well, I was elected in 1959, as you know. And in 1960 and 62, the Republicans gained a number of seats in the House of Representatives. So by 1963 and 65, when the two revolts occurred in the House Republican leadership, we had a majority of Republican members of the House who had been elected in the past 6 years. And the leadership structure in the House, Republicans, was such that the younger ones were not on the policy committee, they were not in the leadership, and obviously they had to wait for seniority to get up into position of any power in the committees, be ranking on any committees or subcommittees. So here we had a majority of us who were younger, who really had no power at all, except in the Republican conference, which is otherwise known as the caucus. That's when the Republican members met all together. They'd meet in the House chambers or one of the big committee rooms. But we practically had no conference meetings at all. So the younger Republicans were sort of excluded.
In 1964, in the presidential election, you were originally supporting Rockefeller and Scranton, but you also said that you could support Goldwater equally because the platform was one on which any candidate can proudly run. It was also said that by many at the time that the platform was tailor-made to Goldwater specifications. How do you reconcile these two statements?
Well, first of all, I was the one of the two assistant platform chairman in '64.
And also the fact that Goldwater supported low-yield atomic weaponry to be used to defoliate the supply trails in Vietnam. I mean, weren't these things a concern for you in supporting Goldwater?
Well, the defoliation in 1964 honestly was not a big issue with me. First of all, the Vietnam War was just beginning to escalate. And at that stage in my life, I was pretty much supporting the strong position against communism around the world, and certainly in Southeast Asia. But Kennedy introduced about 15,000 troops, and in '64 Johnson had escalated the war, but it hadn't penetrated my consciousness enough at that stage, nor had it penetrated generally in the Congress with the people who subsequently turned around, like Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy and the rest. There were only a few, like Wayne Morse, voted against Gulf and Tonkin resolution at that stage. But so there was general unanimity in the country supporting our president on a military venture, and I certainly wasn't ahead of the country on Vietnam at that point.
In 1968, you supported Rockefeller throughout the presidential campaign. How much of this had to do with the fact that he'd be making an appointment to the Senate sometime soon?
None. He was the governor of New York State. I was a congressman from New York State. He was the more moderate candidate from my viewpoint. And I was a part of the Rockefeller team, enlisted early in the group of 5 former National Republican Committee chairmen and senators and congressmen generally who could be helpful to Rockefeller, plus State Committee chairman, and George Hinman, Rockefeller's chief honcho, one of the brightest guys Rockefeller ever had working for him. He's from Binghamton. Used to come down to my office all the time, and he consulted me, asked me to help work out the campaign strategy. I don't mean the larger strategy of how Rockefeller would get nominated, how to get delegates. I did give him ideas at various times on issues, but that wasn't a big factor in the Rockefeller campaign in terms of issues and policies that was set up by his own little coterie of people that he held close to him, including Kissinger, foreign policy. But I was long before there was a vacancy. Had been in all the strategy meetings and everything else, and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated June 6th. That was when the nomination fight was virtually over.
One of the reasons you said you supported Nixon in '68 was because he had a plan for getting out of Vietnam. Given his history and given the things he had said in the past, I mean, he didn't really give any real sign that he was going to follow through with most of that. He'd always come out as somewhat of a warmonger, especially in the late 50s as vice presidential candidate. How could you have supported Nixon given a lot of this controversy?
Well, as a preface, let me say that I was affected very much in the 1968-69 period by what was happening in the country. In terms of Vietnam, I went through a transition myself. I became convinced in 1969, summer 1969, that I had to make some kind of commitment on Vietnam and do something about this. But so I'm not trying to rationalize supporting Nixon in '68 just because he said he had a plan to end the war. I also felt very strongly, as did Javits and a variety of others, that Hubert Humphrey was committed to supporting Lyndon Johnson's policies. And at that stage, regardless of what Republicans had done in the Congress and elsewhere in supporting or even exhorting the president to be more hawkish, the Vietnam War was a democratic product. It was Kennedy had sent 15,000 troops, and then Lyndon Johnson had been president, and that was the period when we escalated. And Hubert Humphrey had been vice president in this whole period, and we had some real doubts as to how fast Humphrey would really repudiate what was going on in Vietnam. And I had pretty much reached the stage in 1968, at the time I was nominated, appointed by Rockefeller to the Senate, that I felt that we either had to do something to extricate ourselves, or either by getting out or by winning. And there was a lot of doubt in all our minds at that point that we could win without paying an unacceptable price in terms of our casualties. That's those of the Vietnamese. So in the campaign itself, I had no difficulty in supporting Nixon and particularly since on domestic issues, economic policies, I was a Republican, and I still am, and I agreed more with Nixon than I did with Humphrey in a whole variety of those issues, and certainly the legislative issues that had come before Congress. But I think the origins of the war in Vietnam go way back to 1954 when we started giving aid to the French, when the French got out, and we started giving aid to the Vietnamese, and we sort of moved in to take the place of the French. But that was a different kind of a commitment. It was a commitment to giving military supplies and support on a fairly small scale to match the supplies and equipment and training that the Russians and the Chinese were giving to the communists in North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It was kind of a commitment we had made ever since World War II to a variety of countries around the world. You would support various factions that you thought were anti-communist, quote unquote, or perhaps, hopefully, democratic, or who were just more friendly to the United States. So dealing with giving military aid and support to those who were our friends or potentially our friends. And so you want to go back to the origins of our commitment to Southeast Asia, the whole area of Southeast Asia, not just Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. It started under Eisenhower, but it should be said that during the period of the Eisenhower administration, there were proposals to send American troops over there, and Eisenhower flatly rejected them and said no. And it was MacArthur, and I used to quote this all the time, it was MacArthur who said that the worst thing that could happen to us, the United States, would be to get involved in a land war, the continent of Asia. And that's sort of ironic with Korea, Truman firing MacArthur. Everybody goes through their periods of evolution, I guess, they feel. But Eisenhower strongly opposed our getting involved with troops in Vietnam, and he had great difficulty in the period of 63 and 64, well, in the early 60s when we were getting more and more involved with that amount of involvement in the United States, that substantial amount of involvement with the troops there. So you draw the distinction. Kennedy sent in 15,000 troops, and we were still talking about training and equipping the Vietnamese. 15,000 troops were also raising the American flag and a commitment to the American military in Vietnam. It's a little different than the small cadre of people we've been sending over there to train and show them how to use the equipment and the supplies and how to organize their supply lines and that sort of thing. And throughout the period, we obviously had the ground that the South Vietnamese government was not ruled by the nicest people, too. I was supportive of the war in Vietnam. In fact, in 1965 and 1966, I was chairman of the Planning and Research Committee in the House, and we put out 2 white papers on Vietnam, which were very critical of Johnson's duplicity and hypocrisy, as we characterized it, in telling us there's a light at the end of the tunnel of McNamara's duplicity and hypocrisy, and they're all encouraging us that if we just put 20,000 more troops in, that'll be sufficient. And the white paper took no position on whether we should get tougher or we ought to bomb Hanoi or mine Haiphong or anything of that nature. We carefully avoided recommending anything, but it was, I think, a rather searing indictment of the lack of candor and honesty in telling the American people what was going on by particularly the Johnson administration, President Johnson himself. We were not opposing the president. We were not opposing the commitment against communism as such. But we were very critical either that the president hadn't done enough militarily, Johnson, or that we shouldn't be there at all, or that he hadn't done things the right way. And then the main theme of the white papers was that he hadn't been telling the American people the truth. He hadn't been totally telling people what the price was for the policies we were pursuing. All of those things could unite the Republican Party from the most conservative to the most liberal, which was what we were trying to do, unite the Republicans and all the factions. Congress had to approve the money for the military forces, but that was an entirely different kind of a decision, as whether you're going to make the money available to keep our military strong and to support the men who are fighting in Vietnam. It's quite different than making a decision as to whether they should be in Vietnam or not. The closest Congress came to making that kind of a decision during this period was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. A question of where the troops ought to be committed that we had such terrible time in Congress coping with. And that difference between supporting the military overall and not supporting Vietnam was very difficult to focus in a way where you could have a clear vote. And that's what led me to the introduction of the amendment to end the war. That was the first proposal that focused on Vietnam by Congress, where we took the responsibility and didn't just blame the president. And we said, in effect, all money is authorized now, but all troops have to be out within 1 year after the date of enactment of this amendment, which permitted the Congress to support the men who were fighting there and support our military generally, but also took responsibility by Congress in telling the president we wanted all the troops out by a date specific, 1 year hence, which I felt was a proper exercise of the authority of Congress, because Congress is the only one that has the power to declare war. That was the whole genesis of my amendment to end the war. I was seeking a way to distinguish those two aspects of our policy. One is general support for the military, and the other is specific support or opposition to a commitment of troops in one sector of the world or another. We made a commitment in that early stage to relatively unpopular figures who were, quote, anti-communist, unquote. And that was a period when we, as a country, certainly in our national leadership, but generally in the country, were almost maniacal about this, being anti-communist. Everything that went wrong in the world we blamed on communism. Everything went wrong in this country politically, say the communists were behind it, which was really a ridiculous position to take. Take a break, I'll read you, I thought, the best summation of the extreme paranoia that we had about communism. Justice Douglas's dissent in the communist case. At any rate, the 54 period, our policies in Vietnam were part and parcel of our whole view of communism in the world. And Republicans were certainly as strong or stronger in their anti-communism. In fact, the Democrats, from my viewpoint, looking back historically, perspective, but overall had a more balanced position on the way to deal with communism. I don't think there's any real difference of opinion between the parties on the evils of communism, as Reagan calls it, the evil empire. But Henry Wallace, there were others of that group that probably were duped into believing that communists were nice people. But overall, the two parties were anti-communist, but one of them, the Republican Party, made a fetish of it. Just to complete that thought with reference to Justice Douglas, in the Dennis case in 1948, which was brought in 1948, and the Douglas opinion was rendered in 1951. Justice Douglas dissented in the case, which upheld the communist convictions in this country. And Douglas, in dissent, said, "Communism has been so thoroughly exposed in this country that it has been crippled as a political force. Free speech has destroyed it as an effective political party. It is inconceivable that those who went up and down this country preaching the doctrine of revolution which they espouse would have any success. How it can be said that there is a clear and present danger that this advocacy will succeed is therefore a mystery. In America, communists are miserable merchants of unwanted ideas. Their wares remain unsold. The fact that their ideas are abhorrent does not make them powerful. The invisible army of the American Communist Party is the best known, the most beset, and the least thriving of any fifth column in history. Only those held by fear and panic could think otherwise." That pretty much sums up, unquote, Justice Douglas's dissent. That pretty much sums up the kind of anti-communist paranoia that gripped this country throughout the 50s, certainly the 40s and 50s, and persists. So I come back to the point that in the early stages of this involvement by the United States, had we been decisively tough, we might have succeeded. We might have gone in and taken Hanoi and Haiphong quickly, and gotten out and left indigenous leadership in charge. And I think probably the only reason Johnson didn't do it was fear that the communists would come in the way they did in Korea. I mean, the Chinese. They could come overrun the borders, which might have happened. Who knows? On the other hand, by the time I got there, the Senate had made this final decision. We had the 565,000 or close to 600,000 troops there. We were bogged down. We had clear indications that had come to me through the Pentagon Papers and some of the stuff that had come on the through Dan Ellsberg, actually, when I was in the Senate, and through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The projections of the intelligence people was that we were going to have to stay there another 10 years if we really wanted to win, and it was going to be large numbers of increased casualties. I had a specific briefing on intelligence that said Nixon's policy, if continued in 1969, would result in 20,000 to 30,000 more American deaths and 5 times that many serious casualties. And obviously many, many hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese deaths. And, well, it turned out from when Nixon became president until we finally got out, there were about 20,000 American casualties. Deaths, not casualties, deaths. And about 100,000 casualties. So that projection was accurate. I became convinced it was accurate in 1969. And why were we going to do that? Why were we going to have 20,000 of our American boys die for something that was not really in the vital interest of the United States? So there was a great transition in my mind at that stage.
From 68 to 69?
Yes. And it was quite different than the focus all of us had in 63 and 64 and 65 and 66, where we argued that going in and being really tough and decisive would work, and that the gradual involvement didn't work. But by 68 and 69, we didn't have that choice anymore. We were in there in a major way. And even when Nixon came to the point of bombing Hanoi and mining Haiphong, it obviously didn't work.
The fact that you say had we gone in early on and been decisive, we could have possibly won the war. That seems to me to be contradictory to mostly everything that Ellsberg says in the Pentagon Papers, by saying that all along we underestimated the strength of the North Vietnamese. They'd been in a war for 20 years. They'd been in this kind of conflict for 20 years, and they hadn't fallen.
I was only conceding that if you're going to get involved militarily in an area, you ought to go in and do it quickly and not try to occupy the country or try to engage in the kind of a war that was taking place in Vietnam, which is essentially a war where you couldn't distinguish civilians from military, where there were many other forces involved, and we actually ended up becoming the biggest issue, and probably ended up uniting more of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Minh behind Ho Chi Minh at the time, because of our presence, which was an alien culture and an alien presence generally. No, I don't think we should have done any more in Vietnam than give training and supplies and equipment, nor do I think we ought to do more than that in most areas of the world. It varies in different areas of the world because our vital interests are involved more in some areas of the world than others. In Southeast Asia, I don't think our vital interests were involved at all. I do not think the military solution, whether decisive and quick or any other variation of the long-term commitment, would have worked in Vietnam. Even if we had made the commitment to go on for another 10 years after the 73 conclusion of the war, from our viewpoint, I don't think we would have been able to run Vietnam in an effective way. We'd have still had a rebel force going on, warfare going on. However misled they may have been, the people in the Nixon leadership did believe they could negotiate a viable kind of a settlement. I still remain firmly convinced that the best system for, in the long run, for most countries is a system that will help them to move gradually to exercise of freedom. It's hard to say that you can exercise freedom immediately. We know we can't just plant our Constitution down over in some different culture and different system and have it take root and produce a democracy. In many instances, they probably need some kind of benevolent dictatorship over a period of time, evolve, but always evolving toward a greater exercise of freedom for all the people, where society produces more for all of the people. And that's very difficult to accomplish, obviously, in the world.
In the House, from the research I did, I got the impression that Melvin Laird and Gerald Ford and you were all kind of, I don't want to say the Three Musketeers, that may not be right, but three of the, very close and doing a lot of different things, and three of the leaders of the House at the time.
It's true.
Melvin Laird went on to be Secretary of Defense, and then a few years later, Jerry Ford went on to be Vice President. And where do you think you might have fit in there had you, been re-elected in 1970? I mean, what are the kind of things that you think might have happened?
If I'd stayed in the House, I'd have probably remained in the leadership. I don't think there's any question I'd been re-elected in 68, and probably thereafter I'd probably be elected in the House. And in that event, I might have been offered a cabinet position or a position in the Nixon administration. I mean, Rumsfeld was also offered the OEO, went there, and a variety of other jobs, and eventually Secretary of Defense, and back in the White House with Ford. And I probably would have done that, and I certainly would have been offered something, maybe even gone to the White House with Ford had I remained in the House. And there was an alienation, certainly, with all of those people, even Ford, on my policies in Vietnam and the positions I took in the Senate, generally the opposition to Nixon on the Supreme Court appointments and so forth. And it made it much more difficult, particularly with a conservative trend in the country, for any of them to appoint me to anything. And certainly Nixon had no desire to appoint me to anything. He was mad in hell. In fact, after all, he and Agnew actively tried to and succeeded, I guess, in purging me, certainly defeating me in the Senate. And so it certainly cut it off, those kinds of opportunities for me that I wanted to do it. If I had been elected in 70 to the Senate, then it would have been much easier to continue to be a major factor in the party. Such as John Sherman, Cooper, Case, Javits, those people while they were in office remained very important factors. But you do need the base of public office normally.
Did you ever consider running again for the House back in Jamestown after the election?
Not seriously. They called me, Republican county chairmen, several of them, and a variety of others from the district. When Jim Hastings resigned suddenly, 74 or 5, I guess it was 75, and asked me if I considered running. And they wanted me to run. Then they had polls showing that I was the overwhelming favorite if I ran. And Stan Lundin basically passed word that he wanted to know whether I was going to come back because he wasn't going to run, but I did. And that's when they should have nominated your mother, but they messed all that up.
Do you think that the major reason for losing the election in 70 was the war? Was your stand on the war?
It was a major cause, yes. It was a major cause of the alienation of a lot of the Republican voters who were angry because I was opposing a Republican president. Had the election occurred in the spring of 1970, all the polls I had and all the polls Rockefeller had indicated I would have been reelected overwhelmingly. But that was before the Buckley defection and the Ottinger spending all the money. He was the only one in the Democratic primary who had money, and so he just completely took over the television commercials in the spring and early summer of 70. So he suddenly went from an unknown to somebody who was really very well known, purely on the basis of saturation of the television commercials. And then Buckley spent about $4 million from his campaign. Ottinger spent about $4 million, and I spent about $1.2 million. So that was a major factor. I think the Nixon opposition, Nixon-Agnew opposition, did more to defeat me than anything else. And ironically, I think the fact that I went on campuses, and although I was booed constantly because I was establishment, I wasn't up for out now as the radical students were demanding, I still was able to go on the campuses, and I became somewhat associated in the public's mind with the radical movement on the campuses. And I really went and told them they should stay as part of the system, and that we couldn't get out immediately, we just couldn't turn around. It took some time, but I was opposed to the war. Put simply, I think the Vietnam War itself, my position on the Vietnam War itself, was not what defeated me. because by the time of the election in 70, about 70% of the American people were finally opposed to the war. So I don't think they were voting on that issue alone. They were influenced by the Nixon-Agnew opposition to me. Some of them, Democrats, liberals, influenced favorably to me, but most of them, Republicans, very strongly against. And so I really lost the election by losing the Republican-based support. And the reason that Nixon and Agnew opposed me, however, was my position on the war.
Do you think that it was necessary that for a Republican figure to take a stance against the war in order for the movement to be legitimized? And do you think if you hadn't been there, somebody else would have done it?
A lot of other people were doing it in different ways. George McGovern was at that time, and he and I led the parade, the March on Washington in November of '69. And we gave some legitimacy to that because there were a lot of radical, extreme elements demanding immediate withdrawal and trashing on Nixon and all of that stuff. And a lot of middle America did participate in that demonstration because we were legitimate figures involved in it. But the answer to your question is no. I think the anti-war movement would have continued and would have been there without me. I don't presume to think that I made that much of a difference one way or another. When I introduced S3000, however, in September of '69, I couldn't get a co-sponsor. Gene McCarthy said it's a little too radical for him. And I couldn't get Hatfield or McGovern or anybody else to co-sponsor that bill because they were just putting in resolutions to say that we ought to negotiate or we ought to have a ceasefire or stop bombing or whatever else. And mine was the first one to put our aggression feet to the fire and said, why don't we cut off the funds a year from now? By the next August, we had a vote in the Senate in August of '70, and there were 40 votes in favor of basically what was my amendment to end the war. Governor Hatfield, so-called amendment at that point. But I would say that as far as I'm concerned, being in public life at that point, I would have found it very difficult to live with myself without having done everything I could, gotten into to try to help. I had a greater opportunity to do something than the average citizen did, obviously, even the leaders of the anti-war movement, because I had a forum from which to speak as a United States Senator. To live through that period and not try to do everything I could was just something I couldn't accept when I finally realized what Nixon's policy was going to be, and there was going to be continuing in Vietnam for a long period of time.
Do you think the fact that you were a Republican opposing the war was important? Not necessarily Republican figure in office.
Very important. That's one of the reasons it made Nixon and Agnew so angry, because they couldn't say that the opposition to the war was partisan. And that really angered them tremendously. But people like Pete McCloskey were opposing the war. When I was in the House, they were opposing the war. Pete was a Marine, fought in Korea, and used to talk to me at great length, trying to convince me we ought to get the Republicans in the House and the leadership to oppose the war. He just didn't have at that point, didn't have the platform and the forum that you do in the Senate. As Teddy Roosevelt said, the White House is a bully pulpit. Well, the Senate is a bully pulpit too. Much better than the House. I think we've covered most of this ground quite thoroughly.